first time in the Russia-Ukraine war, protests have broken out in cities across Ukraine, not Russia, but Ukraine. And there is continuing dissatisfaction among the population. And as we're going to see in a minute, even among the parliamentarians, some of whom are even in President Zelensky's own party. And we're going to unpack a lot of this today with somebody we hadn't had on the show for a while, but glad to have him back. And that is former British diplomat Ian Proud, who's brings a wealth of knowledge to this situation because he used to serve in the British embassy in Moscow. So understands a lot about how that diplomatic interaction goes. Certainly understands the European side. So Ian, really glad to have you on the show today.
Great to see you again, Danny. Glad to be back.
Well, listen, let me just kind of ask you right off the top. I mean, what did you make about these protests? Because I got to imagine that when Zelensky signed this law on getting rid of some of the protections against corruption, which we'll get to in a minute. But I mean, this has Maidan, vibes to it. Now it's really early, so I don't want to overplay it. But I mean, what do you think of these images we're seeing here?
Well, it does hark back to 2013 and the start of the Maidan movement. And actually, that was driven in large part by young people who aspired to a European future, who wanted to tackle endemic corruption that had remained in place in Ukraine since the gaining of independence from the Soviet Union in August of 1991. So that desire for a corruption-free Ukraine is very real, but there's a very clear sense that that hasn't been delivered upon over the past 10 to 11 years. And of course, wars held it back. And now people think, well, actually, Zelensky may be just as corrupt as all the presidents that came before him.
And of course, since this war began, I mean, he's Churchill in a T-shirt. He's the, being feted in the capitals and parliaments all over the Western world. And, with this great applause every time he goes to a European Union membership, just as recently as I think less than a week ago, standing ovation, etc. It seems to me, and I'd like your view on this, that perhaps Zelensky may have gotten the idea that he's bulletproof and can literally do anything he wants. And so that may have led him to this very public disbanding of the NABU.
I think that's absolutely right, Danny. He's high on the adulation, as you say, that he receives in European capitals in particular, and he feels increasingly bulletproof. He's sanctioned oppositionists, within Ukraine. He feels he has a free hand to keep prosecuting the war against Russia, that the West will continue to give him the weapons and the money that he needs. There's nobody to contest him, and I think he's overreached.
And, I mean, we can even go back a little bit further than that to I guess, the end of February of this year, when he had that, really famous blow up with Trump in the Oval Office. Now, at the time, I thought, man, he's done here because Trump was already kind of on the edge a little bit with him, and that, he overplayed his hand. And you don't embarrass President Trump in the Oval Office, get into an argument with the Vice President of the United States, get ushered out of the building, don't even get to have lunch. And then all of a sudden, Zelensky never changed his position. He just kind of kept moving forward. He went from there to 10 Downing, actually, I think right after that, and was greeted very warmly by your prime minister. But then it seemed to be Trump who came back to Zelensky's side rather than the other way around. Do you think that played a role in where Zelensky's at?
Well, absolutely. The main response to Zelensky's bust up with Trump and Vance in the Oval Office was that actually the European leaders circled the wagons against horrible, nasty Donald Trump and gave even more support to Zelensky, and have spent all the time since that particular period back in February trying to persuade Trump that actually Zelensky's a good guy after all, and maybe we should continue to give him the weapons and the money that he asks for. And of course, now, quite frankly, people are looking up and saying, well, actually, have we made a big mistake here?
Are people in Europe starting to ask that question?
Well, I think some people have been asking it for some time. There has been, not that often, but occasional media coverage of the fact that corruption is still a massive problem in Ukraine since the war has started. There are alternative voices who've been speaking out against corruption for some time, and including some people within Ukraine itself. So, I mean, I think that has never gone away. But I think for the vast majority of people fed state propaganda, certainly in the UK, but also across European mainstream media, they'll be looking up and saying, hold on a minute, I thought you told us that this guy was a great savior, like Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings, but suddenly it turns out that he's more like Gollum.
I love that show, by the way.
Me too.
But But let me ask though. I mean, do they really care? And I'm talking about just as a leadership group within Europe, because it's not like they don't know. I mean, you remember earlier this year there was the famous admission by Zelensky that, hey, I don't know where $100 billion went of all the money y'all have given us. I don't know where it went. And so that should have, sounded big time alarms. It got a news cycle blip of about 24 hours, then disappeared. But everybody in power certainly understands that there's lots of black holes. If they don't know where they are, they know they exist. So there's nothing new here, but it seems like they've been willing to just keep going. And is it that maybe they calculate that, well, yeah, it's a sieve, a lot of it's going away, but some of it's getting used for what we want, which is harming Russia?
It's exactly that, Danny. And this actually traces again back to 2013, 2014. We understood fully well that, some of the new leaders coming into Ukraine were corrupt as well, arguably as corrupt as Viktor Yanukovych, but they were our bitches, not Putin's bitches. And so we had to kind of gloss over that fact and focus on the positive, which was the big battle against, Russia itself. So, people will have been aware of the corruption that has existed within the Ukrainian state, certainly within the British government, if my experience is anything to go by. But they've parked that, put a positive spin on it, kept bigging up Zelensky as our great savior, and focused on the main enemy, which people are convinced is Vladimir Putin.
And what about the people, whether in Great Britain or in other Western countries that you may have observed? It seems like, and I'm just speaking for myself as an American taxpayer, where a lot of our money's been going. I'm like, hey, I'm not cool with this money going into. I mean, I don't personally know who's actually getting the money. I just know the black holes are there. It's getting sucked out. I'm not cool with our money going there, especially when there's needs here at our home. Is anything like that happening among the people level in Europe?
I think it's been starting to happen in Germany for a while, the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland political party. I think it's certainly been happening in France. It's been happening in places like Hungary, Romania, and other kind of Central European states. And just now it is starting to happen in the United Kingdom, as we realize that the government doesn't have enough money. It's overspent again over the past period, more than it spent last year by £6 billion. That's a lot by the circumstances of our budget. And people say, well, actually, we want British money to be spent on British people, not forever wars. And I think actually this story about Zelensky and undermining the independence of the corruption organs in Ukraine will just make British people look up and say, hold on a minute, why are we giving all this money to Ukraine and it's being shuffled off into people's Swiss bank accounts?
And this is probably a bridge too far for us to connect the dots kind of thing. But I mean, I think you look at the world before, say, January 2014, when there was protests going on in Kiev, but there hadn't been any bloodshed yet, and nobody in the West, outside of those who really care about what's going on in Eastern European politics, paid any attention at all. It certainly didn't trigger anybody in the mainstream in the United States. And at that time, Europe was comfortably spending anywhere from like 1% of GDP on NATO, like Germany, and a handful of others were at 2%, but most were not, and no one seemed to really care. Now all of a sudden they're being asked to spend 5% of GDP across the board because of everything that's happened here. So instead of all of these things making us more safe, it's just taking more money out of everybody's pockets. And is there any concern among the elite that the people may start to grumble about that?
Well, there's no sign yet that the government wants to change course, but I think it may be forced to change course as political parties like Reform start to gather up and gobble up even more ground from the leading Labour Party and the mainstream Conservative Party too. So I think they will have to confront this very challenging issue. The UK would have to spend another £89 billion a year by 2035 if we meet this 5% of GDP spending target. We can't afford that. We had big protests about cutting £5 billion from the welfare budget to take disability benefits off of British people. And we couldn't even make that cut. There's no way, there's no route to us finding another £89 billion a year, without impoverishing people further, particularly as now we're already expecting increases in taxes anyway.
Can't imagine that would be very popular at the next election to try and defend that policy. But whatever has already existed, and if any, there's been growing dissatisfaction because of the creeping escalation and how much money is being required out of the pockets of citizens all over the European Union or the Western world, really. is now then here comes Zelensky. I think you're really stirring it up. I can't imagine this is making all these people in the West who were keen on keeping this gravy train going against Russia. This is going to cause some problems out. Let's first of all, let's start off. Here is Zelensky actually announcing this new policy curtailing the anti-corruption capabilities.
The main task of Ukrainian diplomacy is to promote everything that protects Ukrainian life in Ukraine first and foremost, and everything that hurts Russia for this war. And each of you must be specific in your own results for the sake of our people, for the sake of Ukraine. This is not pathos, it is true. I believe that this is the main goal. The first is weapons. Of course, we will not publicly discuss the details in each area now, but each of you knows what is in your countries, what are the opportunities for cooperation between joint productions. We now have a truly global cooperation, the largest ever built for Ukraine. But this does not mean that we can stop expanding the activity. We should always look for a new format.
That actually wasn't the soundbite I was thinking of. There's one where he announced that they're curtailing all of these organizations, the NABU, I forget what it stands for, but
we will hold a moratorium, a ban on checking businesses, and about what we have discussed with the government officials. We will hold a moratorium, a ban on checking businesses, and, in general, any interference of law enforcement agencies controlling various state structures into business activities. Of course, in addition to very risky shadow sectors, such as the sphere of alcohol and tobacco products, so that there are no new gray schemes. There is also a clear list of legislative changes, specific measures at the level of the government, to really change the positive conditions for business in our country during the moratorium.
I thought it was interesting that he wants to hold out alcohol and tobacco so that there's no gray zones or whatever, but not for the military weapons and the money where it's just hand over fist going into odd places. But so I think that getting back to our original comment that Zelensky may have kind of thought that he can just call the shots and people are just going to fall in line because he's a hero and he said it. He put it in a claim and the words that, well, this is to actually streamline our ability to do business, to make our war effort more efficient. And if he thought people were going to buy that, I think he's grossly mistaken. And he's now coming to realize it. And Gary was showing all those scenes just overnight of all kinds of protests going on. I don't think that he had any idea that was coming on. That's also existed into the parliament. Now you might expect, and this is the next person here, Artem, I can't remember his last name upon. He's an opposition parliamentarian, but he had some pretty darn harsh comments about Zelensky actually a couple of days before this.
Russian leaders could come to any terms with Zelensky because Zelensky is not a legitimate president. He is not a representative of an authority figure in Ukraine, a representative of the people of Ukraine. He's just a person who seized power in Ukraine, simply a terrorist. So until this thing is not resolved in Ukraine, we cannot speak about any tangible results of the negotiations.
Now, my understanding is that Artem Metchuk there is a minor opposition parliamentarian, but that is really strong language. You would you've heard that come out of Russian mouths a lot, that he's an illegitimate president, etc. How is that going over, do you think, inside of Ukraine?
Well, I don't think he's inside of Ukraine when he said it, because if he was, I suspect he might find himself quickly in prison. I was following on Telegram another Ukrainian MP that similarly criticized Zelensky, and he got arrested. So, I mean, I think the space for people to oppose Zelensky has been clamped down. You saw back in February, previous President Poroshenko was sanctioned, had all his assets frozen, wasn't allowed to appear on Ukrainian state media. The same thing happened to Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's former advisor from the start of the war, and so on. Same thing happened to him on the 1st of May. So, I mean, I think Zelensky is actively shutting down anybody who opposes him in the state. And if we're not worried about that, we should be, particularly in light of news over the past day.
And okay, it's one thing if it's an opposition guy, especially from he's outside the country, and they can just dismiss him as, oh, he's just a Putin stooge, and he's part of the problem, etc. It's a different thing when it's from your own party, as this parliamentarian is from earlier today.
It's great to have a lawmaker from the president's party. It's also great to have a lawmaker who publicly opposes the law that the president signed yesterday. Since a lot of our readers are tuning into this situation only recently and didn't follow the saga, which actually took place only 24 hours, right? Can you please briefly describe why are you against this law?
Sadly, the bill that has been adopted yesterday, signed into law yesterday, published yesterday, and for now, today, it is already a effective bill. It destroys procedural independence of NABU and SAPO. According to this bill, it is Prosecutor General who receives an opportunity to intervene into cases, to tell NABU and SAPO what to do into cases, to reassign cases to different prosecutors. And basically, if I may be very straightforward, after adoption of this bill, Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office and the head of this office is basically a fake institution without any powers.
Okay, that's a pretty significant condemnation there. They're basically powerless. And Ukraine was already, before this war even started, the most corrupt country in Europe. And now then you've taken what, limited guardrails there were off. Interesting, toward the end of that conversation there, the interviewer who was from the Kiev Independent point blank asked her, are we still a democracy? Especially in light of a lot of things you just mentioned there about clamping down on dissident folks, seizing assets of people who don't say what they're supposed to in public media. She, being part of the Zelensky's party, tried to put a gun in face, and she says, oh yeah, of course we still are. I mean, these protests are evidence of it because you don't see us going and clamping down on them. Now we'll see if those things continue on and if anything happens after that. But let me ask you that question. Is Ukraine a democracy?
Well, increasingly it isn't a democracy. Of course, Zelensky isn't elected, but then the provision for that is allowed for in Ukrainian constitution under martial law. Of course, that's an argument to bring the war to an end and hold presidential elections, of course. But there has been a clamping down on political dissent within Ukraine. Political oppositionists have been directly targeted. There's no real independent media in Ukraine anymore. And corruption is at a grand state level, very much driven, some would argue, from the top. There was an interview with the Guardian newspaper, British newspaper, back in 2023, early 2023, with another anti-corruption commission called the National Agency of Preventing Corruption in Ukraine. And at that time, they were alleging that a lot of the corruption in Ukraine centers around the office of the president himself. I think this is a really, really big deal right now, for Zelensky, and him doubling down and actually sort of putting more pressure on dissent is going to cause big problems for him, I think, going forward, because politicians ultimately follow the will of the people, largely for self-preservation purposes, to keep their jobs, in elected office. And the more these, public protests grow, if they grow, then politicians will increasingly come out, as this brave MP has done so.
And what we're seeing, that's obviously is kind of growing even within Ukraine, and we'll see where these protests go. If this was just a one-off, and then the law doesn't change, and they just shrug their shoulders and say, "Well, we tried," or if it continues on, because this could obviously escalate within Ukraine, but it also has ramifications outside of Ukraine. There has been a concerted effort, certainly by Zelensky, but also among many in Europe, to fast track European Union membership for Ukraine. Everybody's not on board that. One of the key ones is Hungary. Now, Hungary is opposed to it, not just because of the corruption, but because of some things that are happening inside of Ukraine on Hungarian ethnic citizens. And the foreign minister came out and again talked about why he is opposed to EU membership for Ukraine.
The president of Zelensky sees Hungary, the Hungarian nation, including the Hungarians living in the Carpathian Mountains, as extremely hostile. He sees Hungary, the Hungarian people, as an obvious enemy. This has become clear to everyone over the past few years, because for many years now they have been taking away and suppressing the rights of the Hungarians in the Carpathian Mountains. These legal provisions have led to the lighting of the church, to the death of a Hungarian. Because he does not want to go to war, he does not want to take part in a senseless slaughter. From this point of view, this threat by the President of Zelensky only reinforces the fact that he is seen as an enemy. I would like to make it clear that no matter how much the President of Zelensky threatens, Hungary does not support Ukraine's joining the European Union. No matter how much he threatens, no matter how much he tries to threaten Brussels.
That's a pretty strong statement there, a pair of statements, actually. He says that, he claims anyway, that that Ukraine sees Hungary as an enemy and therefore some of their people. But then he also says, yeah, and I think that he's an enemy too. What do you make of that?
Well, there's been an incredibly hostile relationship between Ukraine and Hungary, since really the start of the year, when Viktor Orban was talking out against, this senseless war from the very beginning. He was the first and only one to do so at the time. And of course, the ethno-nationalism, the kind of clamping down on the use of Russian language also applies to other languages, and that includes Hungarian languages used by the minorities in the Carpathian Mountains. So while the kind of clamping down on cultural rights and freedoms of Russian speakers has gained a lot of spotlight, this is also very relevant to Hungary, too. And I think the Hungarians feel that this issue has never really been addressed, that Zelensky doesn't care anyway, because he's pushing this kind of Ukrainian sort of ultra-nationalist ethnocentric agenda here, and Hungarians are being marginalized because of that. So I think, in addition to that, you have the energy question where, Ukraine shut off the pipeline through to Europe. High energy prices are being forced on Hungary. The European Commission is forcing them to stop using sort of Russian gas. They've now started building a pipeline into Serbia to get around that. I actually saw Sujato up close and personal in Budapest about 2 or 3 weeks ago at an event I went to, actually with Professor John Mearsheimer, who was there too. Very nice to meet him in person. But, they're very, very clear on this. I mean, this war is costing Hungary a lot of money, and it's disadvantaging Hungarian people, in Ukraine, and they don't want any part of it. They want the war to end, and actually they're really not that keen on the costs involved of bringing Ukraine into the EU.
Now, Hungary, as you mentioned, Viktor Orban has been against this war from the outset and has been pretty outspoken about it. But do you see any kind of a willingness among others in the European Union? Obviously, Slovakia is one, but are there others that may be saying, they kind of got a point? And when stuff like this happens, is that going to potentially move others in Europe away from granting EU membership?
Well, it certainly will. But I think the big deal breaker on EU membership in any case, Danny, is money. I think the biggest blocker of EU membership will actually be Poland, believe it or not, because Poland is a massive net beneficiary of EU subsidies. It gets more EU subsidies than any other European Union country, and would lose all of those billion. I think about 6 billion net a year. It would lose those and end up paying into the EU pot, basically giving all their 6 billion and more euros a year directly to Ukraine, benefiting Ukrainian farmers at the expense of Polish farmers. Believe you me, setting aside the whole cultural, ethnic issues and the issues around corruption, which will also be convenient blockers for states like Hungary, Poland will block it anyway on financial grounds. And, the French war too, I don't know how familiar you are with how belligerent French farmers are when they feel their subsidies are being attacked, but believe you me, they will be a major blocker too. So, and I think the road to membership is going to be a very long and hard one for Ukraine at this stage. This latest revelation, I fear, pushes it further down the track to 10 years and well beyond that, I suspect.
Now I know with NATO, it's a unity. Everybody has to vote against it or any new member, or they don't come in. Is there a similar provision in the EU, or does it have to just be some kind of majority?
Yeah, there is. Although don't underestimate von der Leyen's propensity to maybe change the rules to suit her. But there are lots of different stages to the membership process, different chapters like on agriculture and all the justice and all and that sort of thing. At every stage, every single member state has to agree that the aspirant country has met all of the requirements and can block it at any stage along the way. So it's much more complicated than NATO when it's a yes or no. Hungary and Poland and France can block it for years and years and years, just at each of the stages along the way. It's kind of
let's look at the fundamentals here. What is the purpose of the European Union? I mean, I think that's important, because if it's just to, hey, let's get as many people as we can against Russia, that's one set of criteria. But if it's actually, we want the economic stability of every member nation and the whole group at large to improve, then it seems like you would only want to invite somebody in who's going to provide some sort of net positive. Doesn't seem like Ukraine would meet that threshold ever.
Well, the Ukrainian people are great, well-educated, bright, enthusiastic, and would be a good fit. But the problem is the cost. Ukraine is just so much poorer, than the rest of the EU. Now, the EU was really set up as an economic, social, and cultural community in the aftermath of World War II to allow people to get better political relationships through economics, trade, just cultural collaboration, and that sort of thing. And it's kind of left that and become far too political and focused on containing Russia to its detriment. Actually, but the problem for Ukraine, in fact, is that actually one of the three most wealthy countries in the EU has left, and that's us, the United Kingdom. And the whole kind of EU settlement is based on the rich countries subsidizing the poorer countries. Well, the EU has fewer rich countries now, and Ukraine is by a country mile the poorest country in Europe. So the costs of bringing Ukraine in are just, frankly, just too high, and that leaves Ukraine facing a sort of second-class citizen membership, like cattle class, in some really bad airline, but even worse, sat by the toilets. And whether Ukrainian people feel that meets their aspirations, having lost upwards of 500,000 people in a preventable war against Russia, I mean, it's going to be a massive challenge, both for Ukraine, but also actually for the mainstream political movements in Europe itself.
Well, and as you mentioned, that Poland is maybe a bigger stick in the mud than many people in the United States anyway recognize. I wonder if you could address just real quickly the balancing act that Poland has to do, because in some regards they're Ukraine's biggest cheerleader and biggest advocate, et cetera. But then when you start talking about farmers and agricultural products, it gets a little more dicey. So how do they manage that to keep their population happy, but also keep the facade of European unity supporting Ukraine?
Well, they've been very pro, Ukraine fighting Russia, because obviously dating back to World War II, Poland has a very kind of complex, relationship with Russia. But right at the start of the war, Polish farmers came out in protest against cheap Ukrainian grain flooding into their country after the war broke out. So they've actually kind of blocked moves. In fact, the European Commission took away Ukrainian preferential agricultural rights actually during the course of the war, believe it or not, partly on the back of Polish protests and protests from other countries like France. So, Sikorsky has been saying, let's keep fighting Russia, but actually let's not have cheap Ukrainian grain. And that's how they've been doing it. And by the way, the Poles have also been saying, well, let's force these migrant young Ukrainian men back to Ukraine rather than letting them take Polish kind of welfare benefits as well. So Poland has had a bizarre, frankly, unhelpful and quite ugly, I have to say, positioning on this war.
Yeah, and that's just something that's going to be hard to navigate. Again, it just sort of speaks to the lack of actual unity among all the European, because of the different economic as well as military aspects that are going into this. But if I showed a while ago that Hungary claims that Ukraine sees them as an enemy, that they see Zelensky as an enemy, somebody else sees an enemy here, and that's Sergei Lavrov against the entire European Union. He argues in a recent interview here that this Russophobia is poisoning the water for any kind of settlement.
Europe has become furious. I cannot think of another word to describe it. They are displaying global arrogance towards the Russian Federation. In every possible way, they are inciting their people, indoctrinating them with Goebbels-esque propaganda that Russia is an eternal enemy and an existential threat. They are telling their people that Russia is about to attack Europe and that they should forget about social problems, economic failures, and deindustrialization in Germany and other European countries. They are telling their people to throw all their forces, all means and taxes exclusively into militarization of Europe.
Yeah, we certainly see a lot of that militarization of Europe. But of course, many in Europe will say, well, that's just because you guys are coming after us and you're attacking everything. And if you get through with Ukraine, you're going to start rolling west. So we damn well better be ready. What do you say to those two very divergent views?
Well, it's taken Russia 18 months to advance about 40 miles in Donetsk. And it's, about another 900 miles to the Polish border. So you can do the maths. And actually, military affairs far better than I do. I've been hearing for over a decade that Russian tanks are going to roll into Latvia, Vilnius, Tallinn, Warsaw. There's never been any evidence or indication that was ever remotely likely. And for a long time, I was desperate not to believe that the UK, having been in the UK diplomatic service, as you know, Her Majesty's at the time diplomatic service, desperate to believe that we weren't Russophobic, we just had bad foreign policy. I now increasingly am sadly forced to, confront the possibility that in fact we are just, irrationally Russophobic. And actually what we really need to do is to have a big grand reset of relations with Russia and with Ukraine so that all parties can coexist, focus on the economic, social and cultural collaboration. Sadly, I see no prospect for that anytime soon.
Well, and to Russia's perspective, it's not completely without justification that he claims that everybody in the West is Russophobic and coming against them. We had, I'm sure you saw here just a few days ago, you had an American General Donahue who came out and said, hey, man, we can take Kaliningrad down faster than ever. And in the article, he pointed out that Kaliningrad is approximately 47 miles wide and surrounded by NATO on all sides. NATO and the U.S. Army now have the capability to, quote, take that down from the ground in a time frame that is unheard of and faster than we've ever been able to do. Now, that was certain to get some reaction from the Russian side. And before I show you what Sergei Lavrov in that same interview said about that claim, what is your understanding from having served in the British embassy in Moscow? How important and how emotional of an issue is Kaliningrad to Russia?
Well, firstly, in Kaliningrad, they have nuclear capable Iskander missiles. So good luck with that.
There's that.
But
Didn't
no,
know
it has historical. I mean, it's their Baltic Fleet base, a big military presence there, of course. But it has historical significance to them. Going back to the end of the Second World War, it's frankly debatable whether it's ever formed part of the previous Russian Empire. But it's kind of modern history kind of context. It resonates with the Russians on the back of the Second World War and their big struggle to kind of push the Nazis all the way back to Berlin. So I mean, it's in the modern era, it definitely kind of resonates and has a strong emotional tug for them. But really, it's a big military launch pad for their Baltic Fleet.
So it's not something that they're going to take lightly if someone talks about how militarily they can take it down. And to drive the point home, here is Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
The statement by NATO leaders that they are about to preemptively crush the Kaliningrad region. This probably sends a very alarming signal to any normal person about what plans are brewing in Brussels, in Berlin, and in Paris and London, of course. So the reason for this strategy is impunity, the constant incitement of the Kiev regime to carry out provocations, terrorist acts against civilian objects and peaceful citizens of Russia. These actions will not stop, and of course, they will receive a worthy response. Russia will achieve all the goals that the EU is trying to block by using the Kiev regime.
So Russia continues to say over and over, as he did at the end of that, that if anything happens, first of all, in Kaliningrad, we'll take care of that. And then the second part of that, I think he circles back around to where we are right now, in that there's meetings, I think, as we're speaking right now, in Turkey, in Istanbul, the third meeting of the two sides together. Almost hadn't been any news at all, anything that's come out about that. But he seemed to reiterate that, by the way, we are going to continue to claim we're going to get everything that we want, or we're not going to stop fighting. How do you see his comments?
I think that's consistent with everything the Russian side has said, right back to the start of the war. And the Ukrainians have gone to Istanbul wanting to talk about prisoner exchanges, all very positive. There have been some movement on that since the first two sets of talks in May, and on the return of Ukrainian children. That's been an ongoing dialogue since the start of the war, in fact, but nothing else apart from arranging a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. I had an article in Responsible Statecraft today saying, well, actually, unless these talks are going to get into the core issues, which are Ukraine's NATO aspiration, issues around the disposition of territory and forces after the kind of war ends, then there will be no peace deal. There will be no Zelensky and Putin meeting. There have to be these underlying issues on the Russian side addressed. But from Zelensky's side, as I also pointed out, Donald Trump's 50 days until you get secondary sanctions threat expires on the 2nd of September. Well, before that, people have been off on their summer break. So Zelensky doesn't need to cut a deal in Istanbul because he thinks that on the 2nd of September, Russia's going to get more sanctions anyway. That's my take.
And so why do you suppose that they're going through and doing this? Why go through the diplomatic dance when Russia has said very clearly beforehand, we've not changed any of our situation? Gary keeps putting up this 12-point plan that they came in the second meeting, which was basically, in my view, little more than a requirement for unconditional surrender. Here's our position. You either follow all these points, or we're just going to keep fighting. So Russia's pretty clear on that. But Zelensky is also clear on that we're not going to do any of those things. And in fact, I want more stuff. And I'm demanding a meeting with Putin that he knows that will never happen before anything's solved. So why then have this meeting at all?
Well, Zelensky needs to, keep his Western sponsors happy that he's trying to find a diplomatic resolution to the conflict. He wants to keep getting weapons and money from the West. He has to show that at the very least he's trying to kind of broker some sort of peace deal with Russia, even though I see absolutely no evidence that he's motivated to do that. But from the Russian side, the 12-point peace plan, I mean, really, every side will go in with a maximalist position. But believe me, that from the Russian point of view, they have three big priorities. First is NATO membership. Second is disposition of land, how that's recognized at the end of the war. And the third is kind of, cultural and linguistic rights of Russian speakers within Ukraine. And they are by far the three kind of top issues. Everything else is just kind of detail.
So they might be willing to negotiate and to give and take on some of those other points, as long as those three, which are non-negotiable, remain sacrosanct. Is that a fair statement?
That's my view, yes.
But then again, you have to get into the situation. In fact, one of the things that you just said, which it just kind of raises my eyebrows, like, wait a minute, because if Zelensky is engaging in this diplomacy to, quote, keep the European and the Western people on his side, the leaders, they know that nothing's going to happen. So that has no impact whatsoever, either going or not going. Is it, and maybe I'm being a little bit cynical here, but is it from the Western leaders' perspective, all right, we need you to do this so that the people can think, he's really trying to have a negotiated settlement, because they clearly aren't fooled.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that too. Our Western mainstream media can talk about, while Zelensky is desperate to meet Putin, this is the second time he said he's wanted to meet Putin, and it's Putin is the one to blame, not Zelensky. So yeah, look at poor Zelensky. Okay, he's undermined his anti-corruption bodies, but he's still a good guy and he's our guy, so let's stick with him. So I mean, I think, what you're right. You're absolutely right, Danny, that kind of Western leaders still need to have that narrative sell to their own voters, right? That actually, let's stick with Zelensky. He's the guy for us. And, let's focus on the prize, which is getting rid of Putin.
And so meanwhile, on the battlefield, it's not neutral. It's not a frozen conflict. Russia continues to advance. They've made continued advances overnight, a little bit in the Sumy area, a little bit in the Kharkiv area. Some clashes up in the Kupiansk, but down in the Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka cauldrons, I think it's about time to start calling them that, because there's two of them that are forming. Russia continues to move forward. And if they are thinking, hey, Zelensky, meaning if he's thinking, hey, let's wait until September 2nd when the 50 days runs out. And of course, the U.S. Congress, as you just mentioned, is effectively already on vacation. They've already not talked about some of the issues that are really important to even the Republican base. This whole, what's his face, the pedophile guy. I just went blank on his name. Epstein, the Epstein guy. They've even tabled that. They say we're not going to talk about it. They sure aren't going to be talking about any of these sanctions, especially before this 50 days is up. But then in between those two periods of time, I mean, you're going to have more Ukrainian people dying. And just by the standard that has been going on for this year, there'll be another number of kilometers further forward. They'll have more territory. Probably, I would wager, probably is a better than odd chance that they'll have Kupiansk, because I think they'll probably surround it and just invest it. And then Ukraine will either have to withdraw from it or die in place, like a Bakhmut kind of deal. I doubt that'll happen again. So then there's even less leverage for the Ukraine side on the other side. So what's the end game here?
Well, Zelensky's hoping for some Pearl Harbor moment. I've said that for some time now. He's hoping something to happen that so inflames European sentiment that they decide to kind of send in their own 10,000 troops, to help. So the American cavalry isn't going to be coming, unfortunately. So I think that's it for me. But unfortunately, actually, what's happened over the past day is absolutely dented prospects for that. I think they've dumped a massively cold shower over European leaders who are looking up and saying, well, take a sharp in, take a breath, and let's step back and review what we're doing here with the strategy for Ukraine. As you said, let's see what happens with the protests going forward. But if 2013, 2014 is anything to go by, I can't see them going away necessarily overnight. Let's see. I think European leaders are going to start to kind of bleed support for, continuing to feed the gravy train. I think that is a big, big problem for Zelensky, because that just means that the movement on the ground just accelerates at a fast pace than now. Admittedly, very slow pace, but nevertheless a continued and grinding pace. So, I think the end game for him is to hope something so bad happening that the Americans sends troops, but that seems wholly unlikely, and frankly has done from the start of the war.
And you probably are better positioned to know this than anybody. I don't see any evidence that Russia has any interest in having a Pearl Harbor type issue to do something for that very reason. And I think that's one of the reasons why they've just maintained this slow and steady pace, which is apparently maddening for many on the Russian side. The only possible, I guess, description of that or ramification of that would be if there was a collapse in the Ukraine line somewhere and then Russia just started rolling in. I don't know, maybe that could be called a Pearl Harbor type moment, but that would just be a reasonable result of the policies that both the West and Ukraine have been going into. It's actually more likely than not, and the longer we go, the bigger the chances of a collapse are. But would that cause anybody in the West to say, oh, yeah, let's send an American or French troops? I mean, actually troops in there.
No, I think increasingly, particularly on the back of what's happened over the past day, that it's going to trend back in the other direction against actually that. Seriously, now we do need a negotiated settlement, here, because I think this is going to be a bit of a wake-up call for European leaders, about the situation in Ukraine, that they can't win this war against Russia. They've never been in a position to win the war from the very, beginning with Russia. All that's going to happen if the war continues is that Europe is increasingly going to bankrupt itself and actually tear itself apart, internally in the process. So I think my view is over the next kind of 6 months, there's going to be a real reckoning in Europe about the strategy here, and a real kind of push to settle and actually come with a horrible and ugly and embarrassing confrontation with the fact that they'll need to take some of Russia's needs into account as part of any deal that's made.
Whether they want to or not, I think they'll be kicking and
screaming. Well, they don't want to, but they may have to.
And we'll certainly see how that plays out. I think that's a pretty reasonable prognostication over the coming 6 months. And who knows, it could happen a lot faster if things deteriorate that we don't know about. Listen, in the last bit of time we have here, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the whether it's the British public or the British government in their views towards Israel and Gaza, especially. They signed on to this document here a couple of days ago that condemned Israel for what's going on in Gaza with the starvation, et cetera. But is there any teeth behind it? And is there going to be any actual change in policies in the British government?
I think there has been a noticeable shift in the British government policy just over the past few weeks. Actually, as evidence mounts about the kind of allegations of genocide committed by the Israeli side. Now, before I start, my view is that a settlement should be found that works both for the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. I'm a Christian, so I don't take a view either way about the Jews or about the Muslims. As a diplomat, I want to see a settlement that works for all sides. But clearly, the Western nations have been, particularly Germany, particularly the US, I'm sorry to say, and also the UK have been supporting Israel at the expense of the Palestinian people. It seems to me, in terms of actual policy, but the internal. Clear. Yeah, the internal sort of political kind of concern raised in the UK has reached such a fever pitch now that actually the UK government recognises that it has to actually adopt a much more measured position, on this conflict, and actually say, well, we need to bring this to an end. Like, innocent children are being starved, to death, and that sort of thing. This cannot go on. But whether that amounts to genuine substantive pressure on Israel in circumstances where really the US is the only game in town in terms of affecting sort of what Netanyahu does, remains to be seen. But I think at least it's positive that we're now collectively in Europe sort of pushing for more sort of pressure to be applied on Netanyahu, including via the Trump administration.
But is there any actual pressure other than the headline that you see there on the screen and condemn Israel? That's a word, but is UK ever going to have any actions behind it and either stop giving them weapons if I don't even know how much you are or not giving them, but would they take any kind of punitive measures?
Well, they've had some limited sanctions against the defense and the finance ministers, of Israel, but that's frankly meaningless. The UK has very little leverage over Israeli thinking. We're de facto locked into kind of many parts of US foreign policy, including on sales of F-35 parts, for example. We're part of the kind of collective on how F-35 parts sell. We can't even cut off supplies of F-35 parts from the UK, to Israel. We have practically no influence, Danny. It embarrasses me to admit this to you, my good American sort of friend, but our leverage is practically non-existent. And I fear, much of what the government has said has been largely performative. The sanctions they've imposed are positive signals, but in practical terms, they make no difference at all. It all comes down to the US is the only game in town, really, when it comes to kind of influencing Netanyahu, I believe, on this.
And what about the British people? I mean, are they going to continue to be satisfied with, hey, it's the U.S., we have to follow them, and our guys can't do anything? Or could they voice more displeasure?
Well, they've been voicing a lot of displeasure, and unfortunately, the government has been pretty ham-fisted in clamping down on Palestine action protesters. Some managed to break into Brize Norton Air Base and spray a military transport plane with red paint. And they've responded as if it was Al Qaeda assault, flying sort of aircraft into buildings. So there's been a massive overreaction, banning of Palestine action kind of movements. The UK has a significant Muslim population. We have a significant Jewish population too, and actually voices have become louder and louder that actually what the government has been doing has not been enough. And needs to improve, and that can only happen really working as a collective with European partners, because on their own the UK has little influence, and actually working with the USA. But I mean, British people are not happy at all, it seems to me. Of course, there have been growths in Islamophobia, growths in anti-Semitic attacks too, all of which are utterly reprehensible, and the police should deal with that, absolutely. But the government just hasn't really got a grip on this, and is adopting knee-jerk reactions. It is just boosting its tumbling fall in the approval ratings, and providing a boost to Reform, which ironically is the party that would probably be more anti-Muslim arguably than the Labour Party. Let's see.
Well, listen, that's disheartening to hear. I mean, I was glad to see the headlines. I'm glad to see the condemnation on the starvation, and at least bringing more light to it. My only hope is that the U.S. government and the U.S. population will start just acting like human beings and just with humanity. I mean, those images that are coming out of children starving to death. it's just hard to fathom how that doesn't break our hearts. When anywhere else in the world that had happened, we'd be all up in arms and demanding action and whatever from our government. But so many people are silent, and I have a hard time understanding why so much silence. But
we would not stand back in our countries, in our Christian countries, and stand for this, whether they're Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Sikh, whatever. We would not stand by and have people, children, babies starving to death in our cities and not want action to be taken.
Yeah, we just need to see if we can get that same attitude toward the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, because that's what's happened. But anyway, Will, thank you for coming on today and providing this illumination, especially on a lot of this European aspects of this. We really, really value it, and thanks for coming back on.
Great to see you again, Danny. Let's do this again.
Let's do. And we appreciate you guys. Also, to let you know that we're on podcast. Let your friends know. I know some people, they like to get their news other ways besides just video. We appreciate you guys being here, but just have your friends go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, etc. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and they will find us waiting there for them. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.